Okay, so I'll just briefly tell you a bit about the PFLA, kind of fairly high level. And then after a chat with David, I've been thinking a bit about, I guess, partly the membership aspects of the organization, but then a few other bits, which I think might be interesting to students of business management. So the PFLA really focuses on ruminants and pastures. And for us, those two go hand in hand. We feel that the PFLA champions, in particular, the fact that ruminants can be very regenerative in ecosystems. And in approaching livestock and landscape in this way, we feel we are a key voice, particularly in the UK, as we try and move our farming system towards a net zero world. For us, the particular focus, I guess, is that these animals should be raised wholly from pasture. So it's not just thinking about the animals in and of themselves. There is a whole farming system behind that. And for us, while we're very open-minded about where farmers are coming from, we really encourage them to be moving towards what we would call a 100% pasture-fed model. And in order to do this, we have developed a set of certification standards, which are encompassed under the kind of brand Pasture for Life. We feel that by farming in this way brings a number of benefits. And I think probably the place to start would be the soil and soil health. And from the soil outwards takes you to a whole range of further benefits. And that's from kind of plant health, kind of wider ecosystem health, including water, carbon, biodiversity improvements, quite significant ones if you come and look at some of our farms. And in some cases, not only getting to a kind of net zero carbon balance on farm, but potentially a situation where carbon is being sequestered. And this is something where lots of work is going on in the academic realm at the moment. Not only does this help plants and ecosystems, it also has a big impact on animal welfare and animal health, primarily through feeding animals their natural diet. And then finally, all of this kind of building health from the soil outwards leads to food products which are nutritionally rich and ultimately very health-giving to the people who are eating them. And again, that's something that is a really evolving area of science. For us, as a kind of organization very much kind of centered in civil society, we have to think about impact. It's not necessarily just kind of bare statistics, but what are we trying to do? And for us, really, this means kind of helping farmers transition to these systems, which I've just outlined, but also very much supported by a collaborative supply chain, and then also a general public, which is looking to buy into these systems through their food purchases. And as we think about the kind of opportunity for an organization like the PFLA, if you were in a tech business, you'd be thinking about the kind of addressable market. For us in the UK, 53%, according to DEFRA, of land that is farmed is grassland, and then a further 44% is arable. So I guess we have 53% of the farmed land, which is our kind of more immediate opportunity to create change. But then also, as arable systems come under scrutiny for the sorts of practices that they're using and the sorts of outcomes that we're currently seeing from conventional arable, we're likely to see animals being introduced onto these systems, and that's going to create another opportunity for an organization like ours to kind of increase our impact. I thought it would be strange to talk about what we do as the PFLA and avoid some of these issues which we're all seeing pretty much on a daily basis in the media, and actually sometimes, for example, the recent Oatly advertising campaign about trying to get your dad to reduce their dairy consumption. It's something that we're seeing again and again. And I think it's fair to say, and I have no kind of trouble in saying this, that animal agriculture is responsible for a number of pretty serious negative externalities. And I think there are lots of reasons why people might be thinking about reducing their meat intake and actually increasing their vegetable intake. That could be just the pure basics kind of stats of industrial animal farming, like you can see on the top left there, feedlots. We don't necessarily have have that many of them in this country at the moment, but it's something that at least I personally want to try and avoid. But I think what I'd say here, and this is something which obviously we're having to kind of deal with on a regular basis in our own communications, is that a lot of the kind of anti-meat agenda is very much an agenda, and it's often conflating issues that shouldn't be conflated, and sometimes perhaps putting out misinformation. So that infographic on the top right, trying to compare the kind of global life cycle emissions for livestock. So this is end to end, on farm, all the way through the supply chain. I guess that top right infographic is a kind of classic example of how you can conflate two things in a way that is not only perhaps wrong, but also really unhelpful for the kind of search for the solution. So that particular piece of analysis was comparing the entire life cycle carbon emissions of animal agriculture with the exhaust emissions from transport. So obviously it's not a kind of apples and apples comparison. And then obviously all the kind of red meat and health evidence that is out there largely looks at epidemiological data, which is trying to find correlations between two things, not necessarily causation. So while I think we can all agree that eating huge amounts of meat is not necessarily good for us, finding these sorts of headline grabbing stats is not necessarily helpful to the wider debate. Whereas clearly eating more plants is a good thing. It just doesn't necessarily have to be pitched in conjunction with the anti-meat messaging as well. I suppose the approach that the PFLA takes is that the systems that we're promoting through Pasture for Life, through the certification scheme, are centered around the carbon cycle. This is a cycle which has been going on for many, probably millions of years with ruminants and other animals. And it also relies upon this system being very low, if not zero input. So you're not having the full kind of supply chain carbon externalities that you do in more industrialized systems. And we feel that this kind of very complex but also simple system is perhaps unfairly coming under scrutiny for some of the ravages perhaps of the wider industrial system, which have been unfairly lumped on the ruminant rather than how humans are using the ruminant. There is a saying, it's not the cow, it's the how. It's quite a nice catchy phrase that we do sometimes use, but I actually quite like this hand-drawn kind of diagram of the carbon cycle, which really explains what a key thing this is for planet Earth. And also, helpfully for us, the evidence is actually beginning to back up what we've been saying based on our kind of anecdotal, perhaps observational evidence. So in the top right, there's been some recent evidence published by the University of Newcastle by an academic called Gillian Butler and her team. Gillian's actually now in the recent AGM, she was elected as a director of the PFLA. But this is showing that there is actually a kind of emerging nutritional benefit to the meat and milk from animals that have been raised on pasture exclusively. And actually, in some cases, the really dark kind of reddy orange bar shows what happens when the animal has had a particularly diverse set of forages. So in this case, it's called conservation. It's a kind of subset of our PFLA members who are conservation grazing which means there's a huge amount of perhaps trees being eaten, hedgerows being eaten, and probably a much more diverse pasture than you would expect in a standard ryegrass and clover mix. On the top right, we have the work that comes out of the University of Oxford under someone called Miles Allen, which is looking at the methane issue, because obviously methane through global warming 100 equivalents is being kind of seen as an incredibly bad kind of global warming gas, which obviously it is, but in the specific context of livestock, and particularly in Europe, when livestock, or particularly ruminant numbers, are falling, actually from a methane perspective, this is looking quite good, because if the methane emissions are falling, then actually it's that there is a kind of a much more quick net reduction in methane in the atmosphere. Whereas with carbon, because carbon has a much longer kind of life cycle in the atmosphere, any additional carbon emissions are actually building, kind of accumulating over time. On the bottom left, we have some work that was done last year at Rothamsted in Northwick in Devon, and this was trying to kind of perhaps debunk some of the data that had been used in some of the anti-meat messaging, which was comparing not only meat to meat, gram to gram, so let's say chicken to beef, gram to gram, and its global warming impact, but also sometimes beef or chicken or lamb to plants based on a kind of kilo basis. They then looked at this in comparison to nutrient density and showed that actually, because products like beef and lamb and particularly the ruminants, but also meat as a whole, is actually very nutrient dense, we should be comparing these things with nutrient density factored in. And actually, when we do that, ruminant meat in particular comes out looking much better. And I think what this is all kind of pointing out to me is we need to be looking at these things in a holistic way rather than zooming in on one particular metric. And another example to pull out here is a report by Eating Better that was out last year, which really took a kind of deep dive into the chicken sector in the UK, pointing out that a vast majority, if not kind of 90+% of it, was industrial production. And obviously all the kind of negative externalities of that, which are easy to miss if you're looking at chicken on a pure carbon basis, where it can sometimes look quite good. So I think we're making decent progress in terms of countering some of these negative attacks in the media. And I think particularly for us, the focus on grazed pastures and systems that are very low input means that we have a very good story to tell. So thinking about our work at the PFLA, we split that really into 3 sections. So the first would be culture, which is perhaps a little bit amorphous. I think it ultimately goes beyond education and marketing and events, and it's really about trying to drive our movement forwards. And I think we like to think of the PFLA as a movement rather than an organization. And I think culture is a nice way of describing how we're looking to change behaviors rather than just have kind of very kind of particular discrete impact. Certification, as I've touched on, for us, this is very much about sticking a flag in the ground and providing something for farmers in particular to aim at. So we're as a community, we're very much a broad church. Not all of our farmers are certified, but we really feel that by providing this standard, we're helping people make change. And then finally, collaboration. The PFLA really wouldn't exist without the wider ecosystem of partner organizations that we work with, including the RAU. It's really, well, I guess these relationships have really allowed us to punch above our weight through the first 10 years of the organization's history. From I guess even now we only really have between 2 and 3 full-time equivalent people, but by using all of these relationships, we're able to have a kind of outsized impact. And then finally, all of this is delivered through what is an emerging and relatively recent network of regional groupings. So until until the last few years, the PFLA has been very much a national organization, but we have realized, partly through these things growing organically, but also from a strategic perspective, that encouraging these regional groups to flourish and bringing more online is really going to help us achieve all of these things more quickly. I think it's also important to say that the PFLA is an agroecological solution. Agroecology is helpful in the fact that it's defined by the Food and Agriculture Organization. And for me, it's a very all-encompassing term to include a number of perhaps the terms that we're more used to seeing, such as organic and pasture-fed, permaculture, and the newer term regenerative. And agroecology, I think, is a useful umbrella term. And I particularly like it, and I think this is particularly relevant for the PFLA in that it includes context features like human and social values. And I think this is incredibly important for membership organizations like the PFLA that are trying to affect culture. So thinking about, as David and I briefly mentioned earlier, thinking about the organization as a membership organization. In my slideshow, this was going to kind of pop up bit by bit, and I would take you through this on a kind of narrative basis, but you've obviously seen all of it now. So at its heart, the PFLA is a community interest company. This is a structure that has evolved to allow organizations like ours to operate on a kind of relatively commercial footing while also being not-for-profit and reinvesting any surpluses in the community and the organization itself. At the heart of our membership are the farmers. It was the PFLA was effectively created by and for farmers, and the help of one incredibly enterprising individual who was not a farmer but had a long history working in kind of farming issues in the developing world. What's, I think, particularly interesting about the PFLA is the fact that we've managed to draw in to what is ultimately, or at its core, a farming organization, all these other constituencies. And I think it probably started off with the butchers and retailers, and many of our farmers are doing both farming and these things. We also have some chefs. And I think there's also a bit of overlap probably with the butchering and retailing as well as the farming with the chefs. Over the years, the fact that we've been talking to what have kind of been increasingly clear that the issues we're talking about are very, very important as we deal with the current kind of environmental crises. We've drawn in academics, others involved in conservation, and food and farming professionals, all keen to not only play their role in the community and in the debate, but also because many of them are also farming. And I think this is another nice aspect to the interconnectedness of this organization. More recently, we've started seeing vets coming to us. I think this is partly evidence of a kind of growing interest in the kind of veterinary world, of the impacts of what they're advising farmers to do, particularly when it comes to kind of chemical treatments. And for us, this is fantastic because definitely one of the benefits for us of a pasture for life system is actually the reduced vet and med bills because the animals are just healthy. And I think it's wonderful that the turkeys are voting for Christmas in this respect, and the vets are seeking out our solutions. And then finally, in the bottom right-hand corner, we can't forget the customers, and we do, we do have some what I would call customers, so people who are interested in ultimately the products that our system is producing, and who aren't one of these other constituencies. I guess in some respects, I myself was one of those people when I first joined the PFLA, and I have kind of, well, I think the more and more I've learned, the more I've probably kind of fit more naturally into one of the other boxes. And then finally, as I mentioned on one of the previous slides, we wouldn't be where we are today without this kind of wider network of relationships that we have with partner organizations. So this for me is the PFLA ecosystem. It's centered on a community of a number of different types of member. But then within that, we've kind of managed to create this certified group, which is at the moment just for the farmers, the butchers and the retailers, although obviously, as I've kind of outlined, there is some overlap in terms of what people do for their day job and then their farming job a lot of the time. So this is the kind of core of our membership. I think it's probably worth talking briefly about why these people come to us and what are they looking for. And I think the way I've kind of outlined this in this matrix shows that I think the real common denominators for a PFLA member is learning, it's participating, people wanting to kind of contribute to the community. And then finally, the other thing that seems to kind of cross over all of these different constituencies is actually feeling good. I think a lot of PFLA members feel good for their involvement in the PFLA. And obviously this will be slightly different for each constituency, but I think this is something that's borne out on a daily basis on our kind of very lively forum. The other things that I think are clearly important, so community is perhaps at the core, although I didn't tick the community box for the public, because I think at the moment, at least, we don't really have a community offering for your average customer or consumer. I think there is a bit of this possible, perhaps, on social media. At least some people get that from social media, but I think it's not at this stage necessarily what we're looking to kind of offer. I think the community is very much for the farmers who are sharing best practice with each other. We're beginning to see this happening with butchers and retailers. And then also for the professionals who are looking to learn about farming practice and how they can continue to either advise farmers or perhaps operate in the policy arena. The community is vitally important. And then obviously the certification and the search for premium is very much specific to those who are in the business of selling, and then also the kind of the purchasing and sourcing of product is key for butchers and retailers and the public. So I think the PFLA, in thinking of it in this way, is actually offering quite a lot, but it is all driven through the community. So for those of you who perhaps haven't come across the concept of a flywheel, this is something, I guess, a way of thinking about business and organization dynamics that's been popularized by Amazon. And I think it really neatly shows what the PFLA does. It's definitely not how we have thought of ourselves, but I think as I was thinking about particularly the kind of membership and community aspect of what we do, it really kind of stuck out to me that this was what was going on with the PFLA. And I guess at its heart, the flywheel is a way of thinking about business and organization processes, not in a linear fashion, but in a kind of circular fashion. The idea that everything is driving everything else, and it's not one thing driving one thing drives one thing. So perhaps if we started at membership, so membership really, as I've discussed, is at the heart of this. But I think membership is driving a need, perhaps, for evidence. We work very closely with the academic community. We now have a research group which consists of some academics and also members, particularly farming members, who are incredibly passionate and engaged in the kind of academic sphere. And so building the evidence behind the systems that we're promoting is absolutely key, both for our members, but also for our ability to share this knowledge through education, perhaps use this knowledge to influence others, both within the wider food and farming system, but also then when we start thinking about policy and trying to get policymakers on board with these agroecological systems, which I think it's becoming increasingly clear to me and lots of people within the PFLA that not that we're at a kind of complete crossroads, but I think there is a danger that we move down the business as usual conventional path, but perhaps with a bit more technology and a bit more kind of efficiency driving the agenda. And then finally, all of this gives us much greater reach. And I think we're able, partly through this ability to punch above our weight by leveraging the relationships that we've built over the last 10 years. And then all of this extra reach allows us to drive membership. So I think this is ultimately what's happening in our community, in our membership community. And I think if you look at other examples of businesses that have been founded on the back of a kind of membership community, I think you'll see very similar forces at play, and whether this is at an organization that's as large as Facebook, or perhaps a newer entrant into the food scene, which I'm aware of, called Tribe, which looks to improve nutrition through performance nutrition through the building of communities behind keeping everyone fit effectively. The second thing I wanted to talk about, which I also think is an incredibly important issue that we're dealing with in the food system at the moment, and also, frankly, that I think the PFLA is offering solutions to, is resilience. And I think in my kind of coming up for 10 years in the food system, I think there are lots of kind of business mantras, perhaps, that have been played out often to the bad. And I think in each of these cases, what you're seeing is, through a kind of common business practice, a kind of reduction of resilience in both businesses and systems. I think a classic example is this idea that the customer is always right. And I think actually the customer is not always right. And I think often when the customer thinks it's right and the business thinks the customer's right, you're leading to perhaps a lack of leadership and a kind of unsustainable set of forces being placed on the supply chain, which have unfortunate negative externalities. I think there's often a kind of a strong impulse in businesses that are kind of prioritizing sales and possibly profit, well, not only to reduce labor costs, which will inevitably see a kind of de-skilling of the workforce and a high turnover, but also, sadly, in the case of food, a reduction in ingredient costs. The bigger the business gets and the more pressure there is on margin. And this particularly has a kind of horrendous consequences down the supply chain, and particularly as you get to the farm. I think this analogy also works well in the farming sector, as we think about push for yield and the environmental externalities that has had. And then also, I think the more recent focus on tech as the solution to everything. And I'm certainly not saying that tech doesn't have solutions that are very kind of relevant to the farming sector, but I think there's a danger that we take the skills out from farming and we hollow out rural communities even further. So for me, I think resilience was something that I came to through experience over time. And while I say all of this, I do think there are some amazing examples of both businesses and perhaps business practices where resilience is very much built in. In the classic example of customers always wanting what they want to have and often being given it, I think Riverford is a wonderful example of a business that actually tells customers what they can have, whether that's from, you can have your delivery on Friday and that's it, you can't have it at 2 p.m. on Thursday, or even in the past year, I've been told, in my personal relationship with Riverford and in being a customer of theirs, I've been told a number of times that I can't have all sorts of things because they haven't got them, or the seasonality isn't right. And I think the more we can get business having that sort of conversation with their customers, I think that's going to be vitally important, both for resilience and, frankly, the kind of ultimate kind of carbon and biodiversity and other kind of planetary issues that we're dealing with. I also think resilience means that suppliers and employees really ought to be treated equally with shareholders. I think this is something you see, I mean, frankly, at Riverford, where they've just made all their employees shareholders, but also places like Neal's Yard Dairy, where it's less on paper, but very much part of the ethos that their suppliers in particular are part of the family, and they deal with them in that respect. Community involvement, I think, is another approach to resilience, and obviously we see that with community supported agriculture. And then there are lots of farming examples, perhaps of vertical integration at places like Peelham Farm in the Scottish Borders, and then also prioritising profit over yield in the case of Hilltop Farm in the Yorkshire Dales, who massively cut their herd size in order to focus on, well, ecology and ultimately profit. And so I suppose through thinking about all of these examples, I think it's very clear that we should be prioritising relationships within the supply chain, or I know some people have started using the term supply network, where people are acting cooperatively. And I don't think this necessarily means people have to be in a formal cooperative, but I think the more we can cooperate, the better. And this kind of leads me on to the role of regional groups in the PFLA. And I really see for the PFLA, the regional groups playing this role, allowing resilient supply chains to develop and enabling our membership to act cooperatively. So, for example, I guess the rationale for the regional groups for us is partly at its kind of foundation to preserve the ethos of the organization, which has grown to a point in which I think that kind of collegiality has become more difficult at a national level. And so we're looking to kind of retain some of that by working regionally. It will allow us to increase our activity in all the things we do, and in particular work with partners, perhaps more relevantly in some cases, in the thinking about the wildlife trusts or perhaps the RSPB, which do have a very kind of local, regional approach to things. And yeah, it will kind of strengthen those relationships, and then ultimately get members thinking and working together, get them in a room more regularly through events, obviously which are online at the moment, but hopefully in person in the future, and start developing these supply chains where everyone kind of recognizes that they're dependent on each other, and develop solutions that that prioritize and focus on that fact. And then finally, how you can get involved. So I think it's worth pointing out that the PFLA has a student membership fee, which is half price at £50. This has been going on for some time now. And it's something that I think probably we haven't recently done a good enough job at highlighting to academic institutions. And I think if you are a member, there are so many things you can get involved with. Hopefully at some point farm walks, as that picture points to, but also with running a huge amount of online content at the moment. And actually in that respect, I think the last year of COVID has actually been really infusing for us in thinking about how we can develop much more online content. And I think I think when we do go back to being able to meet in person, that's not going to be at the detriment of all our online activity as well. I hope it's in addition. And then finally, for those of you who aren't aware of these two podcasts, I think both of them in slightly different ways offer really interesting insights into the kind of management and perhaps funding structures behind some of these new ideas in regenerative agriculture. The Farmerama is much more much more kind of all-encompassing, but the Investing in Regenerative Agriculture podcast is very targeted in looking at the sorts of business dynamics currently existing in regenerative agriculture, but also the ones that aren't there yet, and perhaps the ones that need to be developed in order for this movement to really take off. So that's it. That's the end. I hope I'm on time.